On the morning of May 18, 1980, a magnitude 5.1 earthquake struck Mount St. Helens at 8:32 in the morning. Within seconds, the entire north face of the volcano, a section of rock and ice nearly a cubic mile in volume, slid away in the largest debris avalanche in recorded history. The eruption column reached 15 miles into the atmosphere in 15 minutes. Ash fell across 11 states and multiple Canadian provinces. 57 people died. The damage zone covered 230 square miles of Pacific Northwest landscape. It remains the most economically destructive volcanic event in United States history. Volcanologists have spent the 45 years since then trying to get the public to understand that the eruption was not the most important thing that happened that morning. The most important thing was what came after. Not the blast, not the ash column, not the lateral explosion that flattened trees across 150 square miles like matchsticks. What came after the eruption was a wall of mud, ice, uprooted old-growth timber and shattered rock that moved down the Toutle River at speeds approaching 90 miles per hour and did not stop for 75 miles. It traveled through the afternoon and into the evening. At midnight, 16 hours after the eruption began, it poured into the Columbia River and reduced the shipping channel from 40 feet deep to 14 feet. Ocean-going vessels were blocked for a week. More than 200 homes disappeared under the flow. More than 185 miles of road were destroyed, all of it from mud. Scientists have a word for this, a lahar, a volcanic mudflow, a moving mixture of water, glacial ice, pulverized rock, and debris that behaves physically like flowing concrete and carries enough force to bury entire valley floors under tens of feet of material. The public largely walked away from May 18, 1980, with an understanding of eruptions. The volcanologists who studied the aftermath walked away with a different lesson entirely, one they have been pointing with increasing urgency at a different mountain ever since. I want to come back to something before we reach the end of this video. A specific finding published just weeks ago about what happens in specific communities in the path of Mount Rainier when the clock starts. Everything between here and there is what you need to understand why that finding matters. The United States Geological Survey does not use language carelessly. Their official hazards assessment for the Cascades describes Mount Rainier in terms that are unusually direct for a federal scientific publication. Because of its elevation, hydrothermal alteration, ice cap, glacier-fed radial valleys, and proximity to encroaching suburbs of the Seattle-Tacoma metropolis, Mount Rainier is the most threatening volcano in the Cascades. Not the most active, not the most likely to erupt, the most threatening. Washington State has 5 active volcanoes. Of those 5, Mount St. Helens erupted catastrophically in 1980 and has erupted repeatedly in the decades since. Mount Rainier's last confirmed magmatic eruption was approximately 1,000 years ago. By any measure of recent activity, St. Helens should be the one keeping scientists up at night. The reason it isn't is ice. Mount Rainier stands 14,410 feet above sea level. More than 24 glaciers cover its upper flanks. More glacial ice is locked onto this single peak than on any other mountain in the contiguous United States. And that ice is precisely what makes the comparison between the two mountains so sobering. When the USGS has directly addressed this comparison in its public research, the language is explicit. Eruption-triggered debris flows at Mount Rainier are likely to be much larger and to travel a greater distance than those at Mount St. Helens in 1980. The lahars from St. Helens, with its relatively modest glacial coverage at the time of the eruption, traveled 75 miles and blocked a major commercial shipping artery. Rainier, with its vastly larger ice cap, sits 37 miles from the port of Tacoma, 20 miles from the town of Orting, 27 miles from the city of Puyallup. The Puyallup River Valley, which drains directly from the volcano's western flank through Orting and down toward the lowlands, is not hypothetically in the path of a future lahar. The valley floor is built on top of the material left by previous ones. According to the USGS, approximately 150,000 people now live in areas that have been buried by debris flows during the past few thousand years. They are not living near the evidence of what has happened here. They are living on top of it. Here is where the picture changes from a familiar kind of threat to something harder to categorize. Volcanic risk is supposed to follow a sequence. Activity begins, earthquakes multiply, ground deformation is detected by GPS networks, gases rise in composition and volume. Monitoring agencies elevate their alert levels, warnings are issued, people evacuate. The system, the whole architecture of volcanic preparedness, is built around the assumption that an eruption provides warning and that warnings create time. The problem with Mount Rainier is that the most dangerous lahar scenario does not require an eruption at all. The upper portion of the volcano has been chemically degraded for centuries by a process called hydrothermal alteration. Superheated groundwater and magmatic gases rising through the rock over long geologic periods have converted structurally sound volcanic andesite into soft clay-rich material, a substance that, when saturated with water, behaves less like rock and more like a substance looking for any downhill path available to it. The USGS has mapped this zone of weakness and found it concentrated on the western flank of Rainier, the flank that drains directly toward Orting and the Puyallup Valley. Approximately 500 years ago, a section of that flank let go. There was no eruption. There is no geological evidence of a magmatic trigger. A mass of hydrothermally weakened rock, saturated with groundwater and glacial melt, slid from the west face of Rainier and transformed as it moved, incorporating water, ice, and loose material into a lahar now documented as the Electron Mudflow. It traveled down the Puyallup River corridor, deposited material more than 20 feet deep at the location where the town of Orting now stands, and very nearly reached the city of Puyallup before spreading into the lowlands. At the time, the valley was essentially uninhabited. The USGS has modeled what would happen if that same event occurred today using computational software called DCLAW that simulates the extent, depth, and movement rate of lahar inundation. The model results are precise on one point. A lahar of similar origin could reach populated communities in under an hour. For Orting specifically, Pierce County Emergency Management puts the available window at approximately 42 minutes from initiation to inundation of the valley floor. And the warning system, the network of seismic sensors and acoustic flow monitors installed in the valley to detect a lahar in progress and trigger community evacuation sirens, would not activate until after the lahar had already begun moving. The system is designed to detect, not to predict. It measures a flow in progress. In the Electron Mudflow scenario, there is no volcanic unrest to monitor beforehand. The first signal would be the lahar itself. The USGS has stated this plainly in its published research. At least one of Mount Rainier's large historic lahars may have occurred when the volcano was quiet and not providing the warning signs typical of a restless and erupting volcano. The 500-year-old Electron Mudflow may be one of them. which means the clock for Orting could start without the sensors that guard against it having any precursory information to act on. The sirens could sound, and the community would have with the signage, the drills, and the official guidance all repeat, approximately 42 minutes to reach high ground. If you live in Pierce County, in Orting, in Puyallup, in Sumner, in Bonnie Lake, anywhere in the shadow of that mountain, tell me in the comments right now. Tell me whether your neighborhood has marked evacuation routes, whether your children's school runs the annual drills, whether your neighbors actually know the plan. And here is the question I want you to answer. The USGS has published this evacuation timing data, and it is publicly available. Do you think the people making development decisions in the Puyallup Valley actually know what those numbers mean for the people who already live there? Or do you think they have decided to build anyway? Tell me which way you see it. This community is built on people who are paying attention. If you want to keep following this as the science develops, subscribe. Every story on this channel is grounded in public documents and named researchers. What Pierce County has done in response to this risk deserves acknowledgement because it is not nothing.
Every 2 years, and in Orting every single year, the communities inside the Mount Rainier lahar hazard zones conduct full evacuation drills. Not tabletop exercises, not briefings. Students in the school districts of Puyallup, Sumner, Bonnie Lake, Orting, White River, and Carbonado physically walk their designated routes to high ground, escorted by teachers and monitored by emergency operations centers running real-time coordination. In March 2024, more than 45,000 students participated in a single regional drill that organizers described as the world's largest lahar evacuation exercise. The April 2026 drill, coordinated by the East Pierce Interlocal Coalition, mobilized more than 20 school facilities simultaneously. The official guidance for Orting residents is precise to the point of reading like instructions for a procedure, not a suggestion. When sirens activate, do not wait, do not stop for accidents on the road, do not drive to your children's school because the students are already walking uphill. The recommended primary strategy is to walk out. The roads are expected to be congested. 42 minutes. These communities are not uninformed. They are as prepared as a community can be for a threat that does not announce itself the way threats are supposed to. The drills exist. The warning infrastructure exists. The signage is posted at valley intersections. The schools practice. The emergency operations centers rehearse. The question is not whether these communities know the scenario. The question is whether the scenario, as it is now being modeled with greater resolution than ever before, is one the preparations are sufficient to handle. And that is what the 2026 research makes so difficult to absorb. In April of this year, a study by USGS-affiliated researchers Nathan Wood and Jeff Peters was published in the International Journal of Disaster Risk Reduction. The paper modeled evacuation potential for 736 separate scenarios, combining different lahar source locations, different evacuation destinations, different pedestrian walking speeds, and a range of departure delay assumptions. Specifically, a non-eruptive lahar scenario, the slope failure case, the Electron Mudflow case, the event that begins without the seismic precursors that trigger elevated monitoring. The populations modeled in the hazard zones include, in the paper's language, tens of thousands of residents and employees, thousands of students at primary and secondary schools, and hundreds of individuals at long-term residential care facilities. That last category, long-term residential care facilities, covers nursing homes, assisted living centers, memory care units.
the category of population that is least physically capable of walking an evacuation route uphill in 42 minutes, most dependent on staff and vehicle transportation to move, and most likely to face catastrophic outcomes when every element of the timeline runs without margin. The paper's core finding on evacuation success is this: depending on location, some communities could manage large-scale evacuations over several hours, while others face the potential for substantial loss of life in tens of minutes after lahar initiation. Tens of minutes, not hours. Not the 42 minutes the warning system is calibrated around. For the communities closest to the source, for a non-eruptive lahar without precursory activity, with the first warning being the sensors triggering as the flow is already moving, some populations are in an outcome scenario that the modeling identifies as substantially fatal regardless of preparedness. Pierce County's own Hazard Identification Assessment, the official 2020 document, describes the mechanism plainly. The method of destruction, burying entire communities in a flow of dense mud, does not allow most people caught in it a chance of survival. The drills do not account for the scenario in which the flow arrives before the outcome of the drills is meaningful. The warning system does not account for the event that begins without warning signs. The USGS has been explicit on both of these points, and what was, until recently, a general statement about risk has now been quantified at the level of individual community clusters, individual school populations, individual care facilities by federal scientists publishing in peer-reviewed journals in 2026. 45 years ago, the lesson that the volcanologists took from May 18, 1980, was not about eruptions. It was about what comes down the valley after the mountain moves. Mount Rainier carries more than twice the glacial ice that St. Helens carried on the morning it changed the landscape of the Pacific Northwest. The Puyallup Valley is 20 miles from its western flank. The communities in that valley drill, prepare, post signs, practice walking uphill, and do everything that preparedness asks of them. The scientists who study what happens next are not arguing about whether the preparations are genuine. They are modeling how many people get to the top of the hill. That question did not begin in 2026. It began the morning of May 18, 1980, the day the mud reached the Columbia River and the volcanologists started looking south at a different